Today, we are going very local in our ecosystem building conversation. Rural entrepreneurship, density, place, maybe a touch of the office today on this Builders Live podcast. Hey, I'm Chris Hwang. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. It's Builders Live, this monthly podcast thing we're doing on Ecosystem Builder, joined by Victor Hwang, the founding Right to Start CEO and a legend in ecosystem building. Also joined by Maria Underwood, who I first met via some Birmingham, Alabama organizing, that we'll hear what she's up to now. And what you might not see, or soon you won't hear, is our longtime co-organizer, Brian Brackeen, Lightship Capital general partner. He's not here because of some technical snafus, so I will be routinely, riotously, and ongoingly making fun of him throughout this episode to make sure that he never does this mistake ever again. But before I troll my dear friend Brian, Victor, Maria, what perhaps will become a regular feature of this conversation, let's start with a little bit of bright lights to give people a sense of what do we mean by the great work of ecosystem building. So Victor, Maria, I'm kind of curious, what's a bright light in ecosystem building you've seen over the last month or so? Victor, can I give you the first shot because you were out here last month to know this, and then I'll throw it to Maria.
Sure. Well, one of the cool things that's been happening now, this is the early part of the year, is state legislative season, and so Right to Start has inspired a lot of state legislation across the country. One of the really cool stories is what happened in North Dakota. So last fall, I took this cross-country road trip. I drove from Southern California all the way to Washington, D.C., and I stopped in Fargo, North Dakota, met with Greg Teven there, who's a legendary ecosystem builder there, and he introduced me to Representative Jonathan Worry, who's a state representative in North Dakota. And just to share information, we talked about the work we've been doing. We talked about some of the ideas. We shared our field guides for policymakers, which have a bunch of suggestions. And Representative Worry picked up the idea and has been running with it, which has led to a Right to Start Act bill getting introduced in the North Dakota legislature, a significant amount of momentum. There's a hearing coming up soon. And it's just really cool to see how meetings can lead to grassroots engagement, which lead to new ideas getting into the policymaking sphere, which lead to the development of laws that could potentially shape the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the whole state.
And I always love to hear those examples. We might come to that, back to that, Victor. Maria, what's something bright you've seen in ecosystem building at home or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I know South by Southwest is kind of old hat for a lot of tech people, but for us in Alabama and in Birmingham, it's newer. It's a new place to show up and to be. And 2 years ago, I was there alone as an ecosystem builder. Last year, we did a Birmingham house, kind of a big splash. And then this year, we had our biggest kind of contingency ever of founders, of ecosystem builders, of partnerships. And we had people saying, oh, I've heard about Birmingham. I'm hearing there are good things going on there. So it's been a slow kind of 2-year PR effort by a lot of folks in our region to have people outside of Birmingham hearing about Birmingham and the positive tech ecosystem that we have here. But being there this year as not an ecosystem builder, but as part of a startup, so not having to play that marketing hat as much for the city, but just kind of listening in and being a representative of the city. It was really cool to hear, like, we hear things are going on there. We've heard of Birmingham, it's on our radar. And a lot of people don't know kind of the long work that's taken time to get us there, but we're finally kind of rising. And that was fun. That was just fun to sit back and see.
You guys are inspiring me to switch up my answer. We've in this space and others been interested in many ecosystems markets around the country that had put a lot of effort in entrepreneurship in the 2010s, being very humbled in the pandemic era. And every market that we had technically reported on has had some version of this. And what's interesting to our newsroom is they get to share across markets. But in each of these markets, there's like the sense of, is it only happening to us? Like, you know, Pittsburgh's like, did we only get our butt kicked? And Baltimore's like, are we the only one who feels a little off with our meetup culture? And DC is like, are we the only ones who like, is it because the administration changed? And the answer is no. The answer is anyone who had an entrepreneurial ecosystem, it got weird because a whole generation of leaders kind of either their careers moved forward or the dynamics shifted. And so hearing you guys, what you reminded me of in Philadelphia, where I live, one of the ecosystems we technically cover, there's been lots of very good but genuine conversation of what the heck happened. A whole bunch of groups and movements that were very central and not quite there. But I am very, very charmed by this email that it was a DM, but this image of that I got DM'd in the Technically Newsroom conference room over the weekend of a handful of young founders. This guy, shout out to Blake Newcomer, young entrepreneur who had DM'd me. He rents a desk in our space, and he's like, "Can I have some people over the weekend, some other founders to just come and kind of work together?" So starting this Sunday group, and I was like, "This reminds me exactly like what we and other entrepreneurs were doing 15 years ago, which was just like finding a group of people and just building a thing that we're working on." So I think like kids going to be all right. It's just the entrepreneurs are going to entrepreneur, and so the group of entrepreneurs around the world, but certainly in all of these cities, who are just going all the way back to the basics of get a space, build a company. For them, it's valuable to do it in person together. That for me is like what I'll always picture ecosystem building looks like. And so shout out to the homie Blake Newcomer and the Blakes of the world all around the country doing that work. All right, bright lights. Let's use the density thing and go a bit into rural entrepreneurship. We technically we have a bit of a city brand. I've been teased before about being urban biased, but we do we've done some great reporting, especially post-pandemic, of the pops in rural entrepreneurship. For a brief period there, the highest rates of incorporation gains were in rural communities, admittedly from a low base, because on the whole, urban and then suburban counties disproportionately create more per capita businesses. But we've had some rural entrepreneurship pops. So, Victor, Maria, start me off with, what are you guys seeing in the moment of rural entrepreneurship? What does that even mean to you? And then we'll dig a little bit into the specifics. But can either of you take a stab at what are you seeing in rural entrepreneurship?
Well, I'd say it's sort of a kind of a calibration post-pandemic. You know, during the pandemic, of course, a lot of people left big cities to have the big wide open spaces. And I think what's happened since then is some people liked it, some people didn't, and they found kind of a moving back. But it's still if you look at the data, there's a permanent shift towards smaller areas and more rural areas. It's there. It's not going away. It's sort of, I think the Zoom economy has really shifted the opportunities there. People can live in places they otherwise couldn't before and still be instantly connected and do business with the world. That's a fundamental shift in the world. That's probably not going back anytime soon, if ever. And it's exciting. I think that's not to say they're still, the world is still urban biased in that it's so much easier to be in a big environment and do big creative work with lots of resources around you. But the field is just a little more level for smaller places than it used to be before.
Mm. Yeah, I think we're seeing that in Birmingham and in Alabama as a whole. We have a state-funded tech organization called Innovate Alabama that's focused across the whole state, in every single city and ecosystem, supporting entrepreneurship. But we're also seeing organizations like Generator, Techstars come in and open different accelerator programs from the Gulf Coast all the way up north. Techstars just started a clean water tech in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is, if you're not from Alabama, you don't associate it with the University of Alabama, you might not be as familiar with that city. But we're seeing even the generators and the Techstars start to plant and really invest deeply in these smaller ecosystems. And it's spreading entrepreneurship across the state, whereas in the past it may have been, just in Mobile or just in Birmingham, just in Huntsville. We're seeing it more. And I think post-pandemic, people are realizing, to Victor's point, you can move where you want to move, and people are able to find those resources now in Birmingham. Lower cost of living, those investment dollars you work so hard to get stretch farther here because you can have office space with a team that's not costing you as much as it is in a more typically known tech city. And you can still just hire out those contractors if you can't find them here quite yet. So we are seeing entrepreneurs move into the state for many reasons, and all across the state too.
Can I build on that, and maybe I'll throw it to you too, Victor? But hearing you call out some of those service providers, Maria, that are showing up in lots of geographies, obviously, technically we think about this too. Maybe shout out to friend of the show, Andy Stoll, with Ecosystem Builder Leadership Network. He's building out this what I've been thinking of like an ecosystem stack, which is the chance for rural counties to leapfrog. Like when you look at a bunch of different ecosystems and you say, what does everyone end up what is the problem that everyone confronts and how do they solve it? And when was it homegrown or when did they go out? This is how lots of industries grow up, right? Like somewhere someone figures it out in isolation, and then a bunch of people figure it out in isolation. And then at some point, all those isolated people find each other and they start saying, oh, all right, got it. We're all doing the same thing. We might call it different. But then it gets a little bit easier for each next successive generation because you start saying, oh, all right, these are the tools and resources we need. And Victor, like you're kind of like ground zero of this, the Coffin Foundation, the entrepreneurship playbook. We actually just recently resurfaced that work that you did. You guys published it in 2019. Victor, let's see if I can throw that up quick. But I guess I'm curious. I think I have it here. I'll throw up for people who are listening in the Coffin Foundation's design principles for ecosystem building that Victor really helped lead. This was the beginning of you guys saying like there is a playbook that then places can solve, and one would think then that in a rural county perhaps where maybe there hasn't yet been as much ecosystem building done, which is of course are exceptions, but there's now a playbook to follow. And Victor, you're doing this on the policy side. So like, is that a chance for rural counties to essentially leapfrog people who have been stumbling around and say like, actually, we know what you guys should be working on? Is that how you're thinking of it?
Well, very much. I think so much of the entrepreneurship development, and we talked about this, I guess, last time a little bit, which is that it really historically hasn't been accepted as a official model of economic development. Really, as economic development, the field has emerged in the past half century. Entrepreneurship-led economic development wasn't. It was always kind of like the fringy thing that like a few weirdos would talk about all the time, and now it's moved really mainstream into the center of economic development, which is exactly where it needs to be in the 21st century. And so then it leads to the question of, well, how do you do it? And then you have to start developing sets of tools, right? Like design principles, the ecosystem stack, connect networks for people that are doing it. Basically, ways to measure it and track it. All these things that come with an official field. They haven't existed before in entrepreneurship-based economic development. So making it a thing, calling a thing, making it a thing, giving it the tools to be a thing, that succeed at being a thing. That's all been happening now, and it's been exciting. But you need to have those tools, otherwise people are just flailing around. And I found so many communities, they want to do it, they just didn't know what to do before. And so having these tools now makes it easier and easier for people to be able to do that.
I think sorry, Chris, I was going to respond to the graphic that you had up earlier of Victor was talking through these tools. I think one of the hardest things that I've been seeing in smaller ecosystems is the number one, put entrepreneurs front and center, because I think that is the intent always. But there's so many dollars out there, and smaller organizations, rural communities, we're not used to the risk of that. We're not used to the risk of entrepreneurship. We'll donate money to nonprofits all day long, but we will not invest in early stage startups because it's just not what we're used to in smaller cities. So a lot of those dollars are being given to organizations to then turn around and put into entrepreneurs, depending on how that organization sees the entrepreneur should have them. But from being on the ecosystem building side to being in a startup, I'm also seeing and have seen for quite some time kind of where ecosystems can get lost in translation on what putting entrepreneurs first really means and how to really invest in them and what they need, and focus less on kind of the PR of the city and more on the investment of the entrepreneur, which will lead to PR of the city when they really grow fast. So I think there is some backwards work there that I'm seeing in take place. And if we could flip that to doing exactly what Victor has told people to do, then I think we'd see companies grow faster.
Well, I'll give you one example of where we're starting to see some really cool stuff happening. So I've been doing some work out in Western New York for really since COVID with the Ralph Wilson Foundation, which supports a lot of work out there. And they'd historically supported 3 large entrepreneurial support organizations, which were fantastic organizations. But as we all know, involved in this work, so much of the really cool stuff comes bottom up. It's kind of small, it's unexpected. It's not just the big organization. And so the big organizations, they get large grants. They get $500,000, $1 million grants, seven-figure grants for multi-years. But some of the really cool stuff is like, a few $1,000 to host a happy hour series over the course of a year. It's coffee shop meetings. It's little tiny pop-up accelerators in people's basements, or people getting together for lunch on a regular basis. So much of the really cool ecosystem stuff is small, which is why some of the top-down ways to do it are hard, because they like to write big checks, because it's easier to write bigger checks to fewer players than to write lots of small checks. So what we did in Western New York is we helped advise them and helped create a program called Springboard, which is giving out lots of small grants. So taking big dollars and making them small dollars for ecosystem building activities. So people can can apply for grants from a few $1,000 up to 20 to 50, 30 to $50,000. But it's all for new ideas that are trying to help entrepreneurs, not direct assistance programs per se, but really ecosystem building programs to help build connectivity, to share information, to really support the entrepreneurial community as a whole. And so what that does is it ends up helping entrepreneurs, but it has this ripple effect of showing there's lots of energy and lots of stuff bubbling up across an ecosystem. And so this is the challenge, is when you're a public entity or a large philanthropy or you're a big corporation, you're trying to do big stuff to get, and you want the buzz coming out of that. But the really cool stuff is bubbling up from the bottom, and you want to give lots of little bets and try to spread it around. There's a great example out of Miami. The Knight Foundation did this with its arts work. And, Miami, 15 years ago wasn't known as an innovative arts community. Now, of course, people talk about Miami all the time as an innovative arts community. The Knight Foundation, what people don't realize is the role that the Knight Foundation had in it. They had a program, the name of it escapes me at the moment, but they actually, the former president said, we want to spread arts across Miami like a layer of snow. And they give lots of little grants, like 10K grants, 15K grants, 20K grants for little innovative art projects all across Miami. And now you go to Miami and art is spread across the city like a layer of snow. That little projects work, and you want to spur lots of that cool stuff.
Let's linger on this, because you're hitting on something that I'm obsessed with, Victor. That one of my indictments of many regions is particularly ones who, for a whole bunch of industry consolidation reasons, many of their civic leaders, their business leaders, or large budget holders, whatever, are more likely to be kind of like a regional vice president as opposed to an entrepreneur. And those are very important roles, but what I often find is they often weren't at a thing on day zero, so they don't know what day zero looks like. And as we all know, day zero is very humbling. It's 6 people in a conference room. It's 3 people.
If you can afford a conference room, I mean,
right? Exactly. Fair enough. A Lent conference room. Yes. Exactly right. Exactly right. So I feel like would-be ecosystems get this wrong again and again and again, because they look at the thing that actually is exactly what it should be. Very modest, very a few people, but it doesn't look right to them, because when they've seen success, they've only seen it at a corporate level or at a very established level. And so for them, success is supposed to be a very big thing. And they cannot for the life of themselves believe or recognize. Because as you said, Maria, like everything we know about investing in entrepreneurship is it's many bets, and the market's very humbling. And so you have to spread them, because you cannot get it right. And so you need a lot of little bets, and you won't really know what's going to become the big thing. You don't know which art in Miami is going to be most beloved or not. You just don't. And a lot of leaders, we want to believe that we know, but you don't. And so you have to let a lot of flowers bloom. And I think that's what everyone often gets wrong, is they misdiagnose the right moment as failure when it's exactly the thing that they want to see. True? Yes? Seeing any of this?
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of, like I said, risk aversion, particularly in Birmingham. We're a city built on banking and finance and healthcare. You don't take risks in a lot of those spaces traditionally as a business community. So I've had founders tell me that they went and pitched their MVP to a local company. They got in the door, they got into that meeting. The MVP didn't work because most MVPs have lots of holes you have to shoot in them, and then that company never gave them a second chance because it was a risk. So, it's not even on the investment side. But the risk aversion on like, okay, we have to have these kind of titans of industry, these companies support the failure of the startups and let them fail again and again and again, and keep letting them test the market and keep letting them test their product. And we don't, when you're a risk averse city, which is how you've built your sustainability in the past, it's really hard to shift that mindset to an entrepreneurial mindset. I think, Victor, you're talking a little more earlier about economic development as well. And that's economic development and startup ecosystem growth don't work well together. And we really try to lump them together. We want to see within 5 years, a startup who moves here add 100 jobs. And that's just not how it's going to function most of the time. So convincing kind of funders to support organizations that support founders who may not have growth for 5 to 10 years is a really hard battle to fight, when you're also working against like a chamber whose economic development is, we're going to bring in this plant and it's going to have 500 jobs and that's going to be stable, we assume. So from every level of trying to support entrepreneurship growth, there is risk. And we're learning, I think we're learning as an ecosystem in particular here. But I think in smaller, more rural places in general, we've got to let people fail and fail again. And nobody likes that.
No, I totally agree with that. I think if you look at, when an entrepreneurial ecosystem looks great, what it looks like is it's so different than what like an official leader might think it looks like. It's lots of people in coffee shops sketching on lots of backs of napkins. And lots of people sitting in co-working spaces, if you even have those in your community, or people doing the equivalent of that or hacking that, even if they don't have an official co-working space, but people finding ways to build stuff. And it doesn't look very pretty. And we all know that for the first few years of these things. And in fact, if it looks too pretty, it means you're spending too much time on furniture and signs. So this stuff doesn't look good in the beginning. It's like what Bezos still has, the Amazon, his desk is still the original door that they repurposed, to save money, so they didn't have to buy a desk. They put a door on like a bunch of blocks or something. So I think so you don't get great photo ops off lots of people sitting in coffee shops writing on backs of napkins, but that's ultimately what it looks like. And so it is very much attitudinal. It's much more about attitude than it is about fancy companies looking in fancy buildings. And so that requires a shift. And as we all know, almost all net job growth comes from new companies. And so you can't have job growth and economic growth without spurring entrepreneurship. But the people in many places that are in charge of it don't know what it looks like. And in fact, I would even say, I know we didn't want to talk about any national stuff today, but so much of the national
I tried, Victor.
So much of the national conversation is top down. What can they do for us? As opposed to how do you unleash the forces from the bottom up? How do you unleash the entrepreneurial energies of the country? And so I think that it's just a different way of looking at things that we have a long ways to go, because I'd say by and large, most people don't think of it still that way. And we have a chance though, by the way, America's 250th birthday is coming up next year. And I call it America's 250th startup birthday or startup founding. This is the great startup nation of the world that has actually forgotten how to entrepreneur in many ways as an official thing. And so what better time to renew the American dream through entrepreneurship and reminding people of the original promise of this country was to let everyone forge their own future and to build their own dreams than the 250th birthday. So we're gearing up for that. So at Right to Start, we're going to be building out an effort all around America's 250th startup founding called America the Entrepreneurial. And so we're going to be rolling that out in the coming months and looking for ways for people to help us with that.
We should talk about that, Victor. Our newsroom's doing an interesting reporting series, getting communities to look at setting a vision for themselves 250 years in the future. So we should talk on that. But I promised I would finish a thread on rural entrepreneurship before I want to move to maybe one or two other things in my final like 10, 15 minutes with you guys. So let me push us on a possible hole in what I think we're talking about? I hear us talking about you need shots, you need chances, and that's everything we know about investment theory that then informs what good entrepreneurial engagement looks like. And you're right that we have many local leaders who are presumably in charge of entrepreneurship who like routinely demonstrate that they don't get that and want a much neater single check bet, and don't want these kind of like chaotic little organizing. But so when you have more density of people, almost by definition, you can get more shots. And so in the literature, that has tended to be one theory about why, for all of cities' challenges, put higher population density into a place. It's a decent proxy for patents per capita. It's a decent proxy for incorporations, and it rolls out from that. Suburban communities a little bit less, but have some activities, and then rural was even less. And it's one of the reasons playing out that per capita incomes in rural counties tend to be lower, health outcomes, a ton of things are tend to be less. So, can we still have a lot of shots in a rural county when we, by definition, have less density? How do I, as a business journalist, wrestle with all the research I've always read about the importance of density in building entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem? Victor, fellow like kind of nerd here, how do you square density with rural counties and how that contrasts with others?
Well, I love being in a conversation where nerd is a compliment and
yes,
not insult.
Enthusiastically.
Yeah, so that's good. Having grown up in many places where that was not the case, I appreciate it. I think a lot of people confuse the term density. There's two kinds of density. One is physical density, like being in a really crowded place, and the other is the density of human networks. And the human networks are actually the most important thing for innovation. You know, the densest place on earth, like I think it may be Bangladesh, is not known for being an innovative hotspot for tech and innovation. It's certainly got interesting stuff happening there, but the human networks are actually key. And so you can have dense human networks in more spread out places. Remember, Silicon Valley started as farm country. That was farmland. It was rural. It was spread out. People were not physically that dense, but they had strong networks, and the culture of the people in those networks allowed them to be open-minded to collaboration and experimentation, kind of the stuff we were talking about earlier that often doesn't get looked at, which is people trying stuff out. And so if you have tight networks of people that are trying stuff out, that are working together to try to build stuff and innovate, that is what counts. What happens in large physical, denser physical places is you often have more of that just on average, because people are around more, and so they're able to integrate more. But you have lots of, you look at dense physical communities, and a lot of people don't know each other and are not that willing to experiment, not willing to try out. So I think if you can, it goes to, again, culture and mindset and attitude. If you can shift the way that people think, you can actually do a lot in places that are less physically dense, but by creating these dense human networks.
Maria, are you?
Yeah, when I was leading an organization, that my sole job was to recruit founders to move to Birmingham. It was to help them come find their home here and start their companies, or continue building their companies in the city. And almost every single person who agreed to move here did it because of community. Building a company is lonely, it's exhausting, and you can get on a plane anywhere. You can get on Zoom calls with investors. You can talk to your developers. They can live wherever. But if you are having a hard day and there is no one in your office or next to you, even a founder in a co-working space to talk to, then you're not going to go as far with your company. And being able to show them the resources we had here was the way that we got founders to move ultimately. People ask, Nate Ryan, who I know we both know, Chris, used to always say, like, what's the city's breakfast taco? Like, he's from Austin. So like Austin is the breakfast taco. That's like the thing that they have that people come to eat. So he was always like, what is Birmingham's breakfast taco? It was the challenge that he would put to me. And I think that every region can kind of figure out what their sweet spot is. Then you can use that as a tool to really build community, and to figure out how to bring people to your city. So ours ended up being community. And I know that sounds like cheesy and lame, but the fact that we wrapped arms and resources around every founder who was here so they didn't feel like they were building alone proved that model, Victor, that we are dense in community, even if we are not as dense in population.
Can I push you though, Maria? Because Birmingham's not like not a small place. Birmingham might be a, relatively small city, but your annual
traditional tech ecosystem, we are smaller. Yes.
Right. But everything's on a relative, but I mean, like, anyone who hasn't been to Birmingham, your annual, Birmingham Sloss Tech is in a gorgeous, theater that is walkable to, bars, restaurants, coffee shops. There are hotels. Alabama has several landmark R1 research universities that have what would be familiar to anyone anywhere of like density. There's lab space and there's undergraduates bumping into each other. Those are all hallmarks of what the literature would say they mean by density. They don't necessarily mean it has to be, every square inch of Bangladesh, but it's I am obsessed with the Genentech story of like, where does life sciences come from in the Valley? And I've had this fight with a lot of economic development leaders who have, I think, a very like real estate vision of this stuff. But like, the Genentech is an unemployed 20-something VC analyst cold calling an academic researcher who happen to live in the same city, and they go to a bar and it ends up going somewhere and ends up like creating an entire landmark. Like that structural whole, which is the concept I'm obsessed with, and I'm gonna forget the Mark Hanover's research, but that like we think and have traditionally said innovation comes not when some corporate or commercial real estate person decides it should happen, not inside one lab that someone put there, but when two kind of people unexpectedly are there and like, oh, interesting, I didn't even realize you guys were doing that sort of thing. Yep. And it's that, which is why all the event theory and all the coffee shop stuff we're always talking about, it's really trying to recreate that, the serendipity. It's very hard to get at. And that's easier when someone's walking out of Sloss Tech and goes over to a place and someone else is there. And it's why we tend to think university campuses have that kind of urban DNA. So I guess I'm pushing both of you, but right now I'm going to stay with Maria. Can that also happen in small town? I grew up in a town of 7,000 people with a very charming main street. Can it happen there in the same way? I
think it can, but I think what you get in ecosystems that are smaller, specifically around tech and innovation, is this scarcity mindset of there's not enough funding here, there are not enough resources here, whether or not that's true. You do get this scarcity mindset of like, I have to do this for me. I have to make sure I get funded. And so there's an interesting dichotomy between like, yes, that can happen here. And it does, to your point of Sloss Tech, which is coming up in June. I think there's community, when you are in a smaller community, you do have more opportunity to get in the door with places. Like you're 2 contacts away from the decision maker at a company that could be your customer for your startup, as opposed to 5 or 6. So that is really important. At the same time, I think about like Raleigh, Durham often, and that kind of community that's 2 different communities that have branded themselves as one. And why haven't like Birmingham and Huntsville done that? Which Huntsville has an incredible community of startup innovation and entrepreneurship, and it's very different way than Birmingham does. So what does that look like in terms of us hyper-focusing community in one city versus us spreading innovation and like that community across different cities in the state? And I think we're grappling with that right now at a state level of, do we support one city or do we support the growth across the state? And to the point of the, sprinkle art like snow, that's what we're doing right now. That's the strategy from statewide organizations. And we'll see if that pays off more than, focusing where you already have those hubs.
I think I'll add on to that. I think smaller places and rural places is tougher. It just is, because you have less access to the resources, and the people and the networks that you need. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And to Maria's point, the mindset is actually, the scarcity mindset is actually the worst thing. I think the small town mindset is more dangerous than the small town itself. And that often gets lost. People often attribute it to the small town because people start to think in insular ways, and that actually becomes the problem. But there are plenty of big cities where people think in insular ways as well, and that becomes a problem in the big cities too. So it's fundamentally around how are you thinking. And if you're in a small town and you're looking outwards and you're bringing in the best, contacting and working with the best people in the country to do really cool stuff, you can live anywhere now. I mean, you are really literally an email and a Zoom call and a text message or a Signal chat away from anybody, and you can do it. But oftentimes in smaller places, people just weren't. They didn't learn how to think like that, and they didn't realize that they could just reach out to strangers and do stuff. But there are more and more stories now because the tools are easier now. You can actually live anywhere and do really interesting stuff. I want to talk about one thing Maria talked about, which was when a state tries to do something across an entire state and build like one giant ecosystem. And that generally doesn't work so well because that's actually not how the entrepreneurs and innovators think about their own state, right? They think about it as usually local networks and regional networks. And so in every state I've seen, every state can be broken up into several different regions where people kind of think of themselves culturally, and just in terms of their own self-identity with these different regions. And so building up hubs around regions, I think where people are naturally already aggregating towards, instead of trying to forcing them into some kind of, small town square into a large state round hole. It just doesn't work that way. You have to meet people where they are and think about how do you help them do what they're trying to do better rather than trying to make them do something that totally different than what they're trying to do right now.
Okay, love that, Victor and Maria. We technically for more than a decade reported in Delaware, the state, and I can remember we end up using Delaware as our branding because of a fateful series of conversations with entrepreneurs. And we were at that point 14 years ago being like, would we cover tiny Wilmington, Delaware, city of 70,000, but like a big JP Morgan Chase tech hub? And so they have some real interesting startups that come out of there. Would we be covering Wilmington, tiny Wilmington, Delaware as a satellite city? Or would we cover Delaware as a state? At that point, that community very much was like, we kind of see ourselves as a state of 900,000 people. It made sense. We did a series in Denver, and I can remember this conversation of there was great, and there still is great Colorado branding. And I can remember the entrepreneur roundtable we did was they grappled with like the t-shirts are cool, the stickers are cool. There is like a kind of a Colorado vibe here. But Denver and Boulder, for a whole lot of reasons that many know, are very different than other parts of Colorado. Thinking of Nebraska, we're starting an editorial series with our friends at Silicon Prairie News, shout out. And Lincoln, Omaha themselves have a very different vibe than elsewhere in Nebraska. And so can Tech Nebraska have a Nebraska-wide identity if it's different or the same than Lincoln and Omaha? Something you said pre-show, Victor, and you've preached for so much of your career is, in some sense, you have to kind of like be an observer and then support that, which I want to hear you talk about, but I want to add the ingredient that, like, I think ecosystem building, you're also always a little bit in the gumbo. So like, I don't think you're only ever just observing. You are a little bit shaping, because I think you can shove. When we talked to those dozen entrepreneurs in Delaware 14 years ago, there was a bit of a tug and pull of like, oh, well, should we be the satellite city? We're starting a series in Arlington, Northern Virginia. The DC DMV kind of region is there's like so many different jurisdictions fighting, but there is a narrative in the Arlington, Virginia, like they won Amazon HQ too. Growing population of 250,000. Is that its own city? It's bigger than many mid-sized cities, but they're also only part of a region. So I guess I'm curious, Victor, talk a little bit about just being an observer and how much are you in the mix as an ecosystem builder, about also shaping how big or small geographically you should draw your tent.
Yeah, you're both. You have to observe and shape, which makes you less of an engineer and more of a designer, right? Designers are very much in the gumbo. I think, yeah, it's like I was thinking of Schrodinger's cat, that you shape something by affecting it or observing it. Like you can't observe without affecting what you're trying to observe. And I think one great maybe analogy is the difference between engineering and architecture. So in engineering, you're building a building because you think it's the specs, it's the building that needs to be built. In architecture, you are shaping the space to affect the people within it. You're actually designing it intentionally, knowing how it interacts with the environment and the people in it. And so ecosystem building is more designing than engineering. And you can have a huge effect on a community. I mean, so many in North Dakota, Greg Teven out there, Andy Stoll, who started out in Cedar Rapids and really ended up shaping the country and the world with his work. So many places you can point to people that were both the observer, but also those who actively got into the gumbo and actually shaped it into what it became. I think you have to. I think the world is looking for leaders today. I think at a time where the world seems to have a deficit of leadership today, I would say. Certainly the country does. And a lot of those leaders, most of the great leaders I found, are usually unsung. They're at the community level. They're doing great work that often gets unheralded, but those are often the best leaders, are those doing that roll up the sleeves, make it happen work. They're not all trying to, build their social media profiles and be known influencers or try to, provide hot takes on the world. They're usually doing the work. And it's unfortunate they don't get more attention, but the great work I found is usually unsung at the local level.
I'm going to lose you guys, but Victor, you just popped something in my mind that maybe I can then throw back over to Maria as we wrap up here. Because if this through line for today's conversation was like, can it happen everywhere? And I also want the answer to be yes, but I've grappled with all the research that tells me why it's so much disproportionately is more likely to happen in denser places. What you make obvious to me, Victor, is you just get more shots in a bigger, denser place. So that means you can do it anywhere, but you just get fewer shots. And so what I'm picturing, we reported in Brooklyn for 7 years. And the fundamental entrepreneurial thing I got wrong, and why we ended up pulling out of Brooklyn, was I thought my bet in 2012 or something was like New York was too big. And so it was going to have to break into all these different ecosystems. It was just too big a concept. It was too many people. It was too powerful. It couldn't work. And so we're going to kind of really lean into Brooklyn story. And it didn't happen. And to a lot of the New York start tech community, it stayed firmer in a way that I didn't expect. And one of the things I got wrong was any big place has tons of dummies too. There's just as many dummies in a big place as small place. But you also just have so many incredible stars. And then you get a few times that you can have some bad leaders in a place like New York, but there's so many leaders that you end up with some incredible stars. And so they were able to keep the center because there were enough stars that did incredible work. At mid-size and smaller, and the smaller you get fewer of those shots. And so if you have a great leader, to your point on leadership, Victor, if you have a great leader in a town of 8,000, you can absolutely do it. But you probably don't get a lot of shots. And so if your main ecosystem leader is not really serious about it or isn't really doing the work, you're kind of stuck. But in these other bigger places, there's so many paths that you can have a bunch of dummies and still do great work. That wasn't as cogent as I wanted it to be.
It's ecosystem redundancy is what you're getting at, right?
Yes.
We need, ecosystems benefit from redundancy. And smaller places, you get a wrong shot and people say, oh, you're not going to try. No one's going to try that again for 10 years. It's like, wow, really? They would never say that in New York City. They would never say, oh, one person messed up in a big way. Well, that'll never happen 10 years. They'll be like, no, someone's going to try again in 3 months is what's going to happen. Yes. And at some point it's going to work. So yes, that is exactly what happens.
Well said. Maria, parting shot for me on this idea of, can it happen everywhere? Do you just get more shots?
Yeah, I mean, and I go back and forth with that too, just from the places that I've sat in the ecosystem here. In one sense, if you put all of your eggs in one basket, then somebody's going to have a great meal. Like one city or one place is going to have tons of shots and really be able to run with that. On the other hand, not every idea is a great idea. And I think sometimes if you only focus on one city, then you're going to have a ton of people trying and maybe not being told, we don't tend to let, in Birmingham anyways, let people have a bad idea and tell them that. We just let them perpetuate it because we want people to keep trying. So at some point, if you do spread it out across cities, across ecosystems, the good ideas rise to the top a little bit faster. And you can keep, I think in the startup space, you've got to be able to cut people off quicker. In some ways of you should try again, but this maybe not be it. But if you're focusing everything on one city, then you're gonna just keep trying companies or ideas that may not work. So, allowing people to compete for it a little bit more is also helpful. And I think we are seeing that in test mode right now of whether one city or a full state should get all the resources. And it'll be interesting to watch Birmingham in the next couple of years and the whole state of Alabama.
That is a note to go. The fractious, chaotic, many-entered doorway that is ecosystem building. Victor, Maria, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Maria.
See everyone next time. Bye.